Hey Burn fan, this is Sean for MTG Nexus Red, coming at you with a slightly different video this week. So, normally we do a gameplay video and just kind of talk about, our play lines, etc. This week I thought we'd do something a little bit differently, and that is take a look at how to build a burn sideboard for a particular meta, my approach for how to build a deck when I'm actually working on my own lists. The list I have before you is a list that I pulled that I felt was pretty close to the starting point that I would work on with a list, and then some flex slots that we can work on based on the current meta. Now, as far as the current meta here in October 2023, you have decks like Rakdos Midrange, 4-color Omnath, Izzet Murktide, Rhinos, Living End, Hammer, Hardened Scales, Amulet, Titan, etc. So you can try to work on as many decks as you want, but realistically, you probably should aim for the top, 7 to 10 decks that you expect to see in your own particular meta, whether it's Magic Online or whether it is your local game store or an event you're preparing for. You can't be perfect against everything, so that kind of goes out the window. Now, these 5 cards here are some of the flex slots that I want to talk about in the main deck. As well as the sideboard. We might do some juggling for some cards, but first off, the base of the deck, the cards that aren't really flex slots anymore. Really, these I think are the flex calls. Anymore, Rolling Vortex is basically replaced Eidolon because, well, Eidolon's a pretty terrible card right now. In the face of Solitudes and Furies and Leyline Bindings and all that nonsense. So Rolling Vortex as a 4 of, some people might run 2, 3, 4. I just prefer to run the full 4, free up your sideboard as much as possible. Rest of the deck, pretty standard fare. 4 Swift Spear, 4 Goblin Guide, 4 Lava Spike, 4 Bolt. Nothing fancy. 4 Searing Blaze, although you could argue that 1 or 2 copies of Searing Blaze might also technically be flex spots, but there aren't really a lot of good quality cards to replace them with. 4 Boros Charm, and then 4 Rift Bolt, 4 Skewer the Critics. The 19 lands here are pretty standard. You might sometimes see, say, another fetch land and, 2 mountains, 2 Sacred Foundries, or you might see a 3rd Sacred Foundry and only 2 basic mountains. But the setup I've generally liked is the 3 basic mountains, 2 Sacred Foundries, and then 6 fetch lands on the 4 Sunbaked Canyon. Now, technically, the perfect mix of fetch lands would be like 1/1, 2/2, like say 1 Bloodstained Mire, 1 Arid Mesa, 2 Sacred Founder, or 2 Scalding Tarn, 2 Wooded Foothills, or 2 Bloodstained Mire, 2 Scalding Tarn. Don't get too caught up on that. The only thing that really benefit you have of it is, in the early turn 1, say you don't have a play, so you just play a fetch land. If you play Scalding Tarn, people might think you're on Rhinos, or is it Murktide? If you play a Bloodstained Mire, people might presume you're on Scam with a little bit of a slower start. The only other advantage to playing the split of fetch lands for mono or for red based decks is playing around something like Pithing Needle, but it's kind of minor. Whatever red fetch land you have, just play them. It really doesn't matter particularly. 4 Inspiring Vantage, 4 Sunbaked Canyon, kind of the standard fare for the deck. Now this is kind of the first decision. If you value your life total a little bit more, I'm going to go back to displaying the thing here until we start working on the sideboard. This really comes down to Fiery Islet or Sekenzin. You could argue adding a 7th fetch land. This comes down to, do you want Searing Blaze to be a little bit more reliable? Do you want to have a little bit more play in a little bit longer game at the expense of taking a little bit more damage from your mana base? Or do you want to have, basically a mountain you can't fetch that does have some utility with the ability to channel it, get 2/1/1s, especially like on an end step or something, and add a bunch of pressure to the board? Personally, Fiery Islet's good, but I think in a lot of the builds that I've run, generally I add Sekenzin the mana base because I just like having that another pain-free red mana base. Maybe I've taken a little bit too much damage over the years for my mana base, even though, say, Burn doesn't deal that much damage to itself, but without, a ton of Lightning Helixes in the deck, that is something to consider, especially if you're still in the versions running Eidolon. Now, the rest of the deck, This isn't really something you mess with terribly much. Whenever you're deciding, say, Skull Cracks and Lightning Helixes, the positives for Helix, it helps in racing situations. It kills Ragavan. The downsides for Helix, Ragavan steals it, you're in a lot of trouble. And otherwise, it's not the best burn spell in a lot of non-racing situation matchups. Skullcrack, positives for it. You can get around the damage prevention of the One Ring if you Skullcrack yourself. Also gets around damage prevention for things like Sanctifier and Vec, Borington Forge Tender, etc. Also, obviously, it helps prevent against life gain, against Omnath and Solitude and all that nonsense. So generally, I'm going to start with a 2-2 split and kind of go from there, with Skullcrack being probably slightly higher valued in the meta, just because of its life gain prevention, and then the rest of the deck obviously pretty thoroughfare. But you can switch these out. You could go with 4 Skullcrack, no Lightning Helix, you play Firing Islet, etc. None of that is particularly matters, it's just preference of playstyle. One other card that you'll sometimes see in these lists is some amount of Shard Volley. Not a fan of that card. If you want to play it as a 1/2 on your list to lower the mana curve a little bit, that's fine, you can do that, but for the purposes of the sideboard guide and such that I'm working on right now, not something I would do. Now, sideboard, I have a fairly easy, balanced sideboard here, with the one kind of flex slot being Deflecting Palm, and then the 2 copies of Wear Tear could easily be smashed to smithereens. Now, when you're building a Coherent 75, you want to look at the matchups you feel you're going to face against the most. First off being, obviously, Rakdos Scam. Now, Rakdos Scam, the cards you would want most likely against them, first off, Sanctifier and Vec. Other cards you could consider, Path to Exile and Deflecting Palm. If you look at the cards you would want to board out against Scam, the first one, obviously, Roiling Vortex. Now, people could argue evoking and da-da-da-da-da, but generally when they're going to evoke, it comes down on turn 1 and is when it really matters, and Vortex is just too slow in that regard. Sanctifier, if you top deck it later, still at least blunts the assault of a Fury or a Ragavan or whatever, in addition to making sure they can't scam in the mid game. So I think Sanctifier is just a little bit better. 4 in, 4 out. Now, what other cards could you consider shaving? You could consider shaving Skullcracks if you wanted to bring in the 2 copies of Path XL. The problem with Path is, sure, it one-shots a Fury, but basically everything else you can bolt, and you really don't want to give them extra advantage. So I would, if I'm boarding against Scam specifically today, I would go 4 Roiling Vortex in, 4 Sanctifier and back out. And that's where I would leave off with the sideboarding. Match number 2 that I would consider how I'm going to build a sideboard is Izzet Murktide. Now, Izzet Murktide, you want to take out the 4 copies of Roiling Vortex, and you probably want to take out the 2 copies of Skullcrack. People argue that you want to take out Lightning Helix, and while certainly if Ragavan hits a Lightning Helix, you're in a lot of trouble, Ragavan accruing card advantage with your burn spells anyway just sucks. So I just kind of ignored that particular fact and leave in Lightning Helixes as additional ways to kill what my opponent's doing. So 4 Vortexes, 2 Skullcracks, possibly 2 Skewer the Critics. I like to board in the 4 copies of Sanctifier, 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft, and then I also sometimes not like to bring in Path to Exile. Now, Path is a little awkward because, they obviously play counter spells, giving them more mana is a bad thing, but you need to clear the way for your Swift Spears and Goblin Guides if they don't kill them immediately. It gives you another instant speed way to kill Ragavan. It gives you a way to deal with Ledger Shredder and Murktides. So I would probably bring in most matchups against Murktide. These 2 Firecraft. 2 Path, 2 Firecraft. I don't even know why I'm talking about bringing in Sanctifier. I would not bring in Sanctifier in that matchup. And then go down the 4 copies of Roiling Vortex. I used to bring in Sanctifier against them, but after listening to Andre Maguchi, who is one of the premier authorities, at least in terms of content creation, of Murktide says, just don't bring in Sanctifier. It's kind of middling. You know, sure, it can slow down DRC and Ragavan, but it does pretty much nothing against Ledger Shredder and Murktide, and just makes you take a little bit much more damage. And if they decide that they feel like they have to bring in Blood Moon against you, it's another strike against it. Alright, matchup number 3, 4-color Omnath. Now, 4-color Omnath's a bit tricky because there are so many different variants of it. You know, in general, Searing Blaze is pretty bad against them. You can bring in, leave it in against Delighted Halfling and against Solitude, but sometimes the timing on that can be tricky, especially if they happen to have access to Teferi Time Raveler. So generally I board out the 4 copies of Searing Blaze, board in 2 Exquisite Firecraft, and really that's about all you have to board in. You could board in Path, maybe, but it's not that great other than dealing with Omnath, and even then that's kind of a losing battle. So just board out 2 copies of Searing Blaze, board in 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft. And this is one of the matchups you could argue that having 4 copies of Skullcrack in your main deck. So if you value this matchup over, say, any type of racing situation, this is a matchup you could certainly include 4 copies of Skullcrack just to have that extra anti-life gain stuff. Rolling Vortex stays in this matchup, but it's certainly a matchup you can consider running the 4 Skullcracks. Alright, next up is Temur Rhinos. Now, Temur Rhinos, the one card you immediately want to board out is the 4 copies of Searing Blaze. It's not good. Don't try to leave it in. You might kill a Shardless Agent, or you might double spell to kill a Rhino, or you might kill something like a Subtlety or Bone Crusher Giant. Just isn't worth it. Don't bring in Path to Exile. That's a losing fight. The cards you do want to bring in, 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft, 2 copies of Chalice of the Void. One of the 2 matchups this is in the sideboard primarily here for. Now, if you can't afford Chalices and you want to go with additional cards, you could run the additional copies of Skullcrack in your sideboard. Those will be perfectly reasonable to bring in. But I would bring in 2 Chalices, 2 Exquisite Firecraft against Rhinos and kind of call it a day from there. Once again, another matchup where Skullcrack versus Lightning Helix doesn't particularly matter, but Lightning Helix might buy you an extra turn when you're being chased down by 2 4/4s very quickly. Next up is Living End. Now, Living End is a bit of a weird one. Historically, especially when Living End was the Jund variant, it was a very good matchup for Burn. Now, still, a lot of Burn players, I think in general, think that the matchup is good overall. I would kind of argue that the matchup is very close. Game 1 is your best opportunity to win, especially if you're on the play, because they very consistently put 10 to 15 power into play on turn 3 and wipe your board. The nice part, 4 Rolling Vortex in the main, makes that matchup pretty reasonable. As far as cards, 4 Searing Blaze again kind of get boarded out. You bring in the 2 copies of Exquisite Firecraft, 2 copies of Chalice of the Void. Now, where things get a bit dicey is you could potentially bring in 2 copies of Wear Tear if you choose to have that in your sideboard over, say, a 3rd and 4th copy of Smash, because they're almost always going to bring in some amount of Leyline of Sanctity against you. Now, numbers vary. Sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 4. So this freeing up your ability to cast your burn spells. And you want to leave in burn spells that impact the board. So Boros Charm, can give one of your creatures double strike. Lightning Helix can potentially kill one of their creatures. Riftbolt Skewer, can target their creatures to potentially get them out of their way. But between their disruption, the Force of Negations, the Griefs, their ability to deal with Rolling Vortex that way, and their ability to bring in Leyline in the post-board games, matchup I think is very, very close. It might even be, it's very play-draw dependent in my opinion. But I would probably board out the 4 Searing Blaze, board in the 2 Firecraft, board in the 2 Chalice. If you suspect they're on Leyline of Sanctity, you might bring in some copies of Wear Tear over, say, Skewer or Riftbolt. Or you could even board out Lightning Helix, although I think Lightning Helix might be important in racing situations a little bit there. Alright, next up is Yawgmoth. Now Yawgmoth, ideally you'd want to be able to board out all 4 copies of Roiling Vortex, but it does pay to leave some in, as a lot of times they're going to rely on things like Shouldered and Blood Artist to keep them in the game. Sometimes they might board in something like Scavenging Ooze. So leaving a couple Vortexes in, despite the fact that they're a creature-based deck, isn't terrible. The only card I absolutely want to bring in that matchup is Path to Exile. They don't do a ton of damage via combat, so Deflecting Palm's kind of a little bit awkward. So I'd bring in 2 Paths, cut 2 Roiling Vortexes. This is another matchup where Lightning Helix can help you a tiny little bit. They can sometimes blank your removal if Yawgmoth's in play, so Helix isn't as good in those situations. But it does help with the racing situations. But you could also argue that Skullcrack's pretty good in that matchup, keeping them from getting life. So once again, you know, these are kind of interchangeable slots, but I would board out the 2 Rolling Vortexes, board in the 2 Path to Exile, call it a day there. Next up is Amulet Titan. Amulet Titan's a terrible matchup, no matter how you cut your teeth on it. That's the one matchup where you probably want Deflecting Palm. As far as what you would cut, probably Searing Blaze. The only card it really hits is Azusa and Arboreal Grazer, and both of those, while helpful, Azusa's already done their damage, and Arboreal Grazer is just not really worth leaving in spells for. As far as the cards you would bring in, you'd bring in the couple copies of Path, you'd bring in your 1-of Deflecting Palm, and you could bring in, say, a 1-of copy of either Wear Tear or Smash. Wear Tear a little bit better if you're looking to kill Dryad. Smash a little bit better if you're only mainly worried about Amulet, but bringing in too many cards for Amulet's a little bit suspect because they can certainly beat you without it, especially if they have Radiant Fountain in their 75. They can play more of kind of a life gain ramp control game. So I'd bring in 2 Path, 1 D-Palm, and 1 Wear Tear or Smash. Board out the 4 copies of Searing Blaze, or you could just even bring in 2 Path, 1 D-Palm, Shave 3 Searing Blaze, and not worry about Wear Tear or Smash. Do not overload on Artifact Hate. It will not end well for you. You'll be stuck with cards in hand. And even if you blow up an Amulet, it doesn't usually slow them down enough to be relevant. You just need to be as aggressive as possible, be as fast as possible, and hope to get a little bit lucky. You can board out a copy or 2 of Roiling Vortex. It's not great in the matchup, but it does punish them for Summoner's Pacts. Pact of Negation, if they happen to be running it. Them taking 5 damage can be enough to swing the matchup a little bit. But still, not a great card. You could board it, some number of them out, if you want to board in more of your sideboard cards. Next up, Hammertime. So, definitely want to board out the 4 copies of Rolling Vortex in that matchup. Not the best card. You know, they don't really play anything free except for Mishra's Bauble, sometimes Memnite or Ornithopter, which they don't really need most of the time. They basically have 2 game plans. They have the Go Fast, Bonk You plan, and then they have the Urza Saga, make tokens, get a Shadow Spear, Smashy plan. Both of those get significantly harder to deal with when they're also mixing in either Sanctifier Invect or Burrington Forge or postboard. They also have cards like Surge of Salvation and Spell Pierce, depending on the version, as well as Blacksmith Skill. A lot of cards you have to play around. 4 copies of Rolling Vortex absolutely need to go. Cards you would want to bring in: Path to Exile, Smash to Smithereens. Wear Tear, sure. If you want to go down that route, I would trim the 4 Whirling Vortexes and either the 2 Skullcracks or say 2 Skewer or 2 Riftbolt, just because of mana efficiency. Now Skullcrack helps to buy a turn against Shadow Spear, but it doesn't swing the matchup all that much. Does not target creatures, so probably board out these 6. Maybe a Boros Charm or a Skewer to be able to bring in my 2 Path, my 2 Smash, Deflecting Palm, and the Wear Tear. Now, I don't say don't overboard with Burn, but this is a matchup that's bad enough. You're going to want to board in quite a number of cards in your sideboard. The final one we'll probably be going over this week is Hardened Scales. Now, Hardened Scales is a newcomer back to the format, but has been around for quite a while. It's basically Affinity with more complicated math. Now, Affinity is a bad matchup anymore, just because of the nature of how their deck is built. Urza's Saga also being a very bad plan for us to deal with. So, 4 Roiling Vortex out, you bring in your Pass, you bring in your Smashes, you bring in your Wear Tears. You could potentially bring in Deflecting Palm, but I just think with Ravager and whatnot, you want to lead with your Pass, your Smashes, and Wear Tears. Board out the 4 copies of Roiling Vortex, and potentially board out your 2 copies of Skullcrack because they don't interact with creatures. Yes, that does leave you vulnerable to life gain, but I'd rather be able to kill any one of their creatures with my spells rather than leaving in life gain prevention when they can just smack you for 1 million out of nowhere, shoot you with a Walking Ballista, get you with a Yawgmoth Nexus, etc. They're not as reliant on something like Shadow Spear, so board out all your life gain spells, board in your Pass, your Smashes, your Wear Tears, and if you're feeling frisky, bring in your 1 D-Palm. So if I were to develop a list myself, it would probably look, minus these 5 cards. This is pretty close to the sideboard that I would run. Deflecting Palm, I'm not a huge fan of, but there is a lot of matchups like Hammer, Amulet, Affinity sometimes, that having a 1 of is nice. Certainly you can run 4 Smashes over 2 copies of Wear Tear. I like Wear Tear because I like having a little bit of utility with my ability to blow up my opponent's, Urza Saga token, or blow up an artifact and an Urza Saga at the same time, or the ability to deal with a Leyline of Sanctity out of something like a Living End. So this is kind of where I'd stop with the list, probably get rid of these. I'm not a huge fan of the Fire Outlet, so that's why I tend to lean towards Lixakenzen. But once again, this is kind of minor details that you can run, but it's kind of how I would build a sideboard against what I would consider the top 10 most likely decks you're going to run into. Let me know down in the comments below if you like this kind of content, kind of discussing how to build a burn sideboard, build a burn coherent 75, and hope to see you for next week's video.